The next person we have coming up is David Walker, another person who I personally feel very, very, very lucky to have here. He's doing great work, and I've had the privilege of hearing him speak and read his book, which, by the way, are for sale outside. David describes himself as a liberation psychologist, which is interesting. He's a writer and a musician. Since 2000, he's consulted with the 14 Confederate tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation in central Washington, while his personal connections to Indian country reach back to his childhood and Missouri Cherokee heritage. His recent critiques and historical analysis of the U.S. mental health system's checkered role with Native Americans for Indian country today are both well-regarded and controversial. He's done many other things, which you can read about in our program. And we will hear him speak now.
I'm really grateful to all of you for allowing me to speak with you today. I'll be using words, as we go forward, I'll be using words like native and white this morning. But I'd like you to try with me to understand them in a certain way, historically. Race is a biological fiction, but the single most important social and political reality of our time. In the U.S., the word Native American is an updated, politically correct version of the word Indian. But ultimately, these words were invented by white people and fortified by academics in the 1800s who studied the skulls of the deceased victims of genocide they called crania Americana. Both Native and Indian became a strong source of personal and community identity among youth from hundreds of diverse cultural communities kidnapped or coerced away from their families into federal and church-operated boarding schools from 1890 to 1970. Now, if you were to visit for a while with one of these communities who were forcibly organized into a tribe in 1855 in central Washington state, a tribe called the 14 Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, you'd soon realize how many know their history, know what happened to their people, and fully realize the incredible sacrifices their elders made to preserve their language and traditions and their very selves against the unrelenting forces of white supremacy. This is a community I've had the honor to consult with for the last 17 years. I'm going to ask you to challenge yourselves this morning by considering history not so much as linear, but alive and circling all around us. This is one of many Native views on the matter. Each day is a new day, containing the seeds of the last. Time cycles back and forth. What goes around comes around. We are constantly presented with the opportunity to make each day over again. Seasons change, but our opportunities to reseed the day are given to us with every sunrise. Now, I invite you to look at this picture carefully, not so much in relation to the individuals in the foreground, but for the portrait in the background, the only presidential portrait to currently merit inclusion in the Oval Office, President Andrew Jackson. And the question I have is, while symbolic seeds of white supremacy are being defended and nourished so they can grow, what will you plant and harvest next fall? I'm hoping you'll realize how important understanding history is in relation to each circling day wherein history repeats. I will seem to speak about the past as I move forward, but I'm asking about the past and the present. I'm suggesting that your own experience with the mental health system is quite comparable with its history among Native people in this country. What does that look like? My appearance is clearly that of an older, let's say well-seasoned white guy. But for reasons I can't fully comprehend, I've lived many days of my life front and center as an eyewitness to the brutality of racism. All my life, my own white privilege has been juxtaposed with the suffering of the racism I've seen. My eyes are open. I'm not asleep. I feel that the only reason I'm permitted to speak before you today is to bear witness before my Creator to the truth of what I've seen and learned. Additionally, I grew up knowing about our family connection to Cherokee people. I have my paternal grandmother, Donna Smouse Barlow Walker, to thank for creating within me a lifelong engagement with our mixed heritage from the age of 6 years old. I'm not here alone. After I arrived at Yakima Nation, this Blackfoot Pikuni man, who is called Long-Standing Bear Chief, became my close friend and challenged me to begin deconstructing and decolonizing myself as a person of mixed heritage. Although he's no longer on this physical plane, I know he's with me and will help me. My adopted Kala, Yakima Kala, which means adopted grandmother, Lavina Wilkins, she knows I'm here as well. She wants me to be sure to mention to you the many snares of the English language that cause us to judge and categorize and label one another. The Yakima expression for leadership is Pinya Iwat Kwa'alani, which roughly means he or she gives it all away. That is, a true leader is willing to sacrifice all they can for the good of the people. To arrive at this state is a lifelong endeavor, and she's encouraged me to give all that I can in what I have to say. That way, I don't need to be so ashamed of the many mistakes I've made along the way at Yakima Nation. So, to begin, we need to fully reject the short-term memory issues from which our society suffers. We need to take the long view of the days we keep reliving. So let's begin recollecting. Here's a translation from the Spanish diary of Christopher Columbus, written shortly after his first encounters with native people, the Taino people, in what is now the Dominican Republic. Weapons they have none, nor are they acquainted with them, for I showed them swords which they grasped by the blades and cut themselves through ignorance. The people here are simple in warlike manners, as your highnesses will see by those 7 which I have ordered to be taken and carried to Spain in order to learn our language and return, unless your highnesses should choose to have them all transported to Castile or held captive in the island. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I please. And this Columbus did, becoming governor of Hispaniola. Under his 25-year tenure, 85% of the 3 million Tainos were wiped out by starvation, enslavement, and disease by the early 1500s. The few surviving Taino were forcibly converted to Christianity. Their medicinal practices were lost. Their spiritual ceremonies using cahoba, the powdered seed from the cohobana tree, a psychedelic which put Taino medicine people in touch with the spirit world, were suppressed, forgotten, or abandoned. Their language became nearly extinct. Their descendants were born mostly through the sexual enslavement of Taino women to the conquistadors. The seeds of their destruction are those of our own impending annihilation. They're here inside each one of us. Now, 5 years before Columbus's arrival, German Catholic clergymen Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published the Malleus Maleficarum, or witch's hammer, a tool of the Inquisition. I consider the witch's hammer the earliest version of today's mental health diagnostic systems, like the DSM and the ICD-10. This book has remained second only to the Bible in popularity for the next 200 years. In writing my first novel, Tessa's Dance, a character came to me who hears voices and has visions and premonitions. Her name is Laureen, and like many Native youth I've been taught by over the years, she grew up in foster care. She comes from a medicine family, a family known locally for having spiritual abilities. In the Yakima way, she's not viewed as pathological, but as gifted. The troubles she's experienced have to do with the gifts she's been given and the misunderstanding she experiences from other people. In terms of the witch's hammer, however, someone like Laureen is possessed by the devil. Here are the symptoms listed in this book. Devils produce not voices but sounds which have some likeness to voices and send them articulately through the outside air to the ears of the hearer. The devils employ certain lower bodies, such as herbs, stones, animals, and certain sounds and voices and figures. Let's be right here where we are in this very space in this building. Just down the road, 380 years ago, European intolerance and white supremacy over the people they saw as pagan or heathen led to the burning massacre of the Pequot people. 1,000 people, mostly women and children, were shot to death as they ran from the flames. How we categorize and label people can kill them. And I'm sorry to say that my generational white grandfather, Richard Walker, was a rifleman in the Pequot massacre. I'm interested in what he teaches me about how I should be living my life now because, as I've said, we have a new day. Only a few years after the Pequot massacre, Puritan John Eliot began preaching among the Wampanoag, who once lived all around this very spot where we are right now. He became convinced that these native people, these pagan savages, possessed a soul worth saving. And this was a new idea, but flawed, that a heathen soul might be saved. It is a belief that is at the heart of the history of the U.S. mental health system in general and in Indian country. This idea that heathens must be saved rather than murdered caused much controversy among white European colonialists just prior to the American Revolution. Ben Franklin himself became deeply involved in the issue when he published a pamphlet in 1764 protesting the massacre of 20 Susquehannock people by what he called white Christian savages. If you'd like to know more about that, look up the Paxton Boys. If an Indian injures me, does it follow that I may revenge that injury on all Indians? Asked Ben Franklin. This was a superb question. A Paxton militiaman, a white supremacist of the time, responded to Franklin's pamphlet by asking, whoever proclaimed war on part of a nation and not the whole? The Paxton argument won and helped to create the Indian War Doctrine, which settled the entire matter in favor of genocide. Words like Indian Wars in so much of American history represent more than historical revisionism. They are an undoing of the very real debates over what it means to kill people in order to replace them. They are a prime justification through the use of words. If it is war, it is not murder. The Texas Board of Education currently controls maintaining such words in high school textbooks across the United States. Now, imagine the use of many different words and symbols to undo genocide and oppression being taught to each successive generation of Americans. Laws are passed, rules and social policies are enacted in countless places all over this country. These many justifications serve a process my Shawnee friend Stephen Newcomb calls domination metaphor. Domination metaphor is the use of language to control or dominate the other with a capital O, that is, marginalized, segregated, or disenfranchised groups of human beings. Domination metaphor serves white supremacist ideology. It is obviously embedded in its rhetoric, and it's also subtly present all through the practices and theories of the Western mental health system. If someone is told, due to your deficits in understanding reality, you are a schizophrenic, they're applying a particular professional version of domination metaphor. They're likely unaware of their participation in the past and are only exercising an assigned cultural role as an expert on you and your behavior. As a licensed psychologist, I've earned a particular type of eagle feather called a PhD. And this has provided me with a priestly status of calling you a heathen or a pagan. Below average, weaker, impaired, inferior, deficient, non-conforming, non-productive, poor reality testing, anosognosic, mentally ill, mentally disordered, to me, are all examples of domination metaphor in the culture of the Western mental health system. A psychology of liberation means surfacing, exposing, and dismantling the power structure of this metaphor. It is what psychologists and psychiatry should be doing. It's the heart of evidence-based practice to uncover and weaken the metaphor of domination within our own selves before we can ever help others to see how it's affected their lives. The most powerful domination metaphor affecting Native America has been that of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny has been a doctrine deeply held by many generations of white people, that they were given the right to take away and occupy the homelands of Native people by God. Here's an example of a visual domination metaphor of manifest destiny. It's by Emmanuel Gottlieb Leutz and called "Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way." The mural was painted in 1862 and still hangs in the House wing of the United States Capitol. In 1820, my white ancestor, Return J. Meigs Sr., became the first United States agent to the Cherokees. He married a Cherokee woman named Grace Starr and sought to preserve Cherokee land holdings through the treaties of Tellico. He died in 1820, and only 3 months later, the U.S. Supreme Court enacted manifest destiny into law by proclaiming white Americans have, quote, a right to take possession of land notwithstanding the occupation of the natives. When today's white supremacists proclaim they want to create an ethno-country, they are reenacting what has always been underway. When they say they want to push out people of color and create their own land and get back to the good old days, this is what they mean. In 1823, Andrew Jackson was a newly elected Democratic senator from Tennessee. Like Donald Trump, he ran on a platform of empowering the common man. By this, he meant poor white men, to reward his many constituents, those poor white men who elected him to office. Jackson worked hard to give them stolen Indian land. Jacksonian democracy reinforced white supremacy in this country. Jacksonian democracy is greatly admired in the White House. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed by President Andrew Jackson, commencing a trail of tears for the 5 civilized tribes, quote unquote, of Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, also Wyandot, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Lenape peoples. The reality of people being excluded from their own land to create a single ethno-country, an all-white country, already happened here. This is what I mean by historical recapitulation. This is how words and images replay a social metaphor that dominates and kills people. In 1839, my ancestors were forced to walk what came to be called the Trail of Tears, along with 16,000 other Cherokee people away from their homelands in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. 2,500 people perished on that forced march. Return J. Meigs IV, the grandson of Return J. Meigs Sr., married Jenny Ross, the Cherokee daughter of John Ross, whose mother, Quatie, died of pneumonia on the trail. Now, I'd never heard of my Meigs ancestors before until Jenny Ross came to me in a dream in 2002. I've heard voices, I've been told things through dreams, and I'm here with you as a peer. "1,500 Cherokees dropped off the Trail of Tears in Missouri and never entered Indian Territory. Elizabeth Jane Albina Alexander Barlow, that's quite a mouthful, another of my Cherokee grandmothers, was encouraged to sign the government rolls for the Oklahoma Cherokee Nation. But if she signed those rolls, she would have been forced to move into Indian Territory with her family, so she hid away who she was. Cherokee women intermarried with white men in Missouri worked hard to keep their stories hidden and to just pass white, always under tremendous fears that they might be discovered and taken from their children or their children taken from them. Elizabeth Jane is buried in an unmarked grave in Stillwater, Oklahoma. On behalf of my family, I reclaimed her and Elizabeth Gibson as my Cherokee grandmothers in a sweat lodge with Eduardo Duran, Joe Stone, and other Native friends in 2001. In Blackfoot, there's a saying, Niksokuwa, all my relatives. In Lakota, we would say, Aho matakwisan, and mean the same thing. And this is a way we recognize that we are all members of one human family. The disruption of the Trail of Tears created many Cherokee factions that worsened with the U.S. Civil War. The Cherokee Nation literally broke apart, with some siding with the Union and others who adopted black slavery siding with the Confederacy. After the war, all Cherokees were punished severely by the federal government in having their reservation lands taken away. It didn't matter what side you were on. This left the Cherokee people in Indian Territory destitute and starving. You can see that Elizabeth Jane Barlow might have been among them had she signed the Cherokee rolls. They'd lost their ancestral home. There were now haves and have-nots. Their matrilineal clans fell apart, and the powerful mothers were compelled to give way to European forms of patriarchal family. The traditional connections between people became frayed and destroyed. These effects began to cascade down through the generations. Many people were now displaced, orphaned, rejected, disabled. It was in this dire circumstance that the Home for the Insane, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind of the Cherokee Nation opened in 1877, the first mental health institution in Indian country. By the 1890s, a social movement had emerged among white people to civilize the Indians they'd made poor, destitute, and displaced. Numerous federal policies of forced assimilation were developed. One focus of this movement was to improve their mental hygiene. There were many resistors to this social movement. There were many people fighting the tyranny of this benevolence. Nonconforming women refused to surrender their children to the boarding schools. Marginalized Native men fought back when white people cheated them. The disabled no longer had family to take care of them and had become homeless and indigent. Also, oil was discovered on what was thought to be worthless land given to the Native people. This is how many Native people became targets for being sent off by the Indian agent and even their own families to the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians, the only facility of its kind. It opened in 1899 and closed in squalor and scandal in 1933 with the discovery that in truth it housed quote-unquote sane Indians. The inmates were found chained to their beds, some for so long that the chains had become embedded in their skins. Few people ever succeeded in leaving Hiawatha. Its cemetery of over 200 graves is all that remains in the middle of a golf course in Canton, South Dakota. The graves there were formerly blessed through the ceaseless efforts of Harold Iron Shield and psychiatric survivor Pamina Yellowbird in 2001. Hiawatha Asylum has been a subject of great fascination for me. The mental health intake forms used there are a little different from what is mandated procedure today within the Indian Health Service Behavioral Health Manual. Inmates were labeled individually as melancholic, feeble-minded, or manic. This was on another day, but we're now living on this day, remember? But every time a Native youth introduces themselves to me by saying, I'm ADHD, or I'm bipolar, or I'm PTSD, I think about Hiawatha Asylum. While Hiawatha was still operating, the domination metaphor was continuing to enter the fledgling U.S. mental health system. This is a page from the first statistical manual for mental disorders created in 1918, a closer ancestor of the DSM and the ICD-10 than the witch's hammer. It tabulated what were called the racial characteristics of inmates in order to serve the interests of the American eugenics movement. This movement is likely familiar to many of you and sought to breed out of the U.S. population the metaphor of mental illness and deficiency, thought to exist within another metaphor, a socially constructed category called race. The words and categories of the U.S. mental health system led to the sterilization of thousands of Native women across the country. Race psychologists of the 1920s and 1930s entered American Indian boarding schools seeking to prove what they already believed, that Native children were inferior. Psychology's participation was widespread, one of numerous skeletons in our professional closet. From this, an intergenerational belief system grew that I've encountered among Native youth today, a belief that they are somehow inferior. This is what they've been told by some of their elders. This is what they've heard from some school personnel who still reinforce this racist lie and tell these youth not to aim too high. Conservative psychologists like Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, authors of The Bell Curve, the most popular psychology book of the 1990s, sold at Walmart and Kmart, used this old pseudoscience, this racist mythology, to persuade the public of their racist beliefs. Their book is considered reliable information by the white supremacist movement. Donald Trump has said that he was born smarter than other people. This is how the mental health system has reinforced his convictions.
Can you repeat that, please?
Donald Trump has said that he was born smarter than other people. This is how the mental health system has reinforced his convictions. With tribal permission, I took several students out to the mission boarding school at Yakama Nation several years ago. It's a place that figures prominently in my novels, and many community members won't even go there because they believe it's haunted. I once worked with an elder who said she witnessed her own sister get raped one night on this front porch. My students were non-Indian, non-Native, but they were quite afraid as we walked up closer. All of them claimed they didn't believe in ghosts, and yet they didn't want to come close to that porch. To become less afraid, we have to come to terms with the ghosts that are haunting our days. The Indian Health Service, or IHS, Division of Behavioral Health, mandates the labeling of Native people for their emotional or behavioral troubles using these documents. Actually, I'll just note right now that this is a process that's going on all around the world with Indigenous people. Now, these are updated versions of the statistical manual that was created in 1918. They're the germinated seeds of the witch's hammer, and they have grown and grown in our contemporary times. The division also mandates the prescribing of psychiatric drugs as a first response to depression by all its healthcare providers. I haven't mentioned yet that the federal government considers many Native people to be depressed. Indian Health Service uses several depression and PTSD screening tests created by drug manufacturers. Native people have the highest suicide rate of all the ethnic categories maintained by the U.S. Census. The word oppression is not contained within these two documents. According to the federal government, Native people do not suffer from oppression. This is a drawing created with a black Bic pen inside a prison cell by a Native youth who is a former gang member. It was gifted to me by his family. Native people suffer more physical violence and with a greater degree of injury than any ethnic category tracked by the U.S. Census. The great majority of the violence they suffer is perpetrated by people from outside their communities. This is how it's always been, but it's not how it always has to be. This young man was labeled with oppositional defiant disorder and bipolar disorder. To me, he's responded with great strength and resiliency to the domination metaphor through his art. He's holding on to who he is while you and I figure out who we are. The youth of Yakama Nation have taught me much more than earning my PhD, my academic eagle feather, ever did. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad for this feather, but I have to recognize who my best teachers have been. I came to love them very much and wanted to make them heroes in the books I wrote because they don't usually see themselves that way. I brought a few copies with me. In Yakama, Ink Atawimash means I love you. Although much of the human suffering we experience is fueled by hate, I believe that love always wins, eventually. But this requires us to face each day as though we might not see the next, and to live accordingly. So I'm saying ink atawimash to you this morning, and also kwala, which means I recognize the time you've made for me and the attention you've given me, and will look forward to returning it. There's no word for thank you in Yakima. It's assumed that we are all here to give all that we can to one another because, after all, we're all related. Niksokuwa, say the Blackfoot Pikuni. Aho Metakwiasan, say the Lakota. Kwala, say the Yakima. Wado, say the Cherokee. And this means thank you very much.